Health Secretary is with us this morning. Matt Hancock, of course. Mr. Hancock, good morning to you. 10 million people are now facing lockdown measures this morning. It isn't a local lockdown anymore, is it?
Well, yes, we did have to take action announced yesterday to bring in more measures in the northeast. And as we've discussed many times, we're prepared to bring in this local action wherever we think it's necessary. And with working with the councils across the northeast, we've taken this action. Ultimately, it's to keep people safe.
Yeah, SAGE scientists, as I said, no longer a local lockdown with 10 million people impacted. SAGE is saying a 2-week national lockdown next month is the way forward. Is that the way we're heading?
Well, what I'd say, Kay, is that we really do need to come together to tackle this virus once again. The virus is clearly accelerating across the country. We've got to take the necessary action to keep people safe. The number of people in hospital is doubling every 8 days or so. And so you saw the action that I took yesterday across the northeast. We will do what it takes to keep people safe. This morning we're publishing the social care winter plan to ensure we keep people safe in care homes, which is incredibly important. Yesterday I put another £2.7 billion into the NHS to keep the NHS safe over winter and to expand, for instance, A&E facilities so they've got the space given social distancing. So we're doing everything we can to prepare, and we're absolutely prepared to take action if that's necessary.
Okay, so in answer to my question, is a 2-week national lockdown, as proposed by some members of SAGE, on the cards next month?
Well, we'll do what is necessary to keep people safe, and the first line of defence is that everybody should follow the social distancing. We've talked about many times, hands, face and space, and keep that social distancing. The contact tracing system, which is working very well, that is the second line of defence. After that, these local lockdowns. And the last line of defence is full national action. And I don't want to see that, but we will do whatever is necessary to keep people safe in a very difficult pandemic.
So that is something that you're considering, a national lockdown?
Well, it isn't something that we ever take off the table, but it isn't something that we want to see either. It is the last line of defence. But what I'd say this morning, Kay, is that the country once again needs to come together and recognise that there is a serious challenge, that the virus is accelerating. Unfortunately, it isn't just cases increasing, it's also the number of people ending up in hospital increasing. That's mainly, and in the mainly the number those sadly ending up in hospital are across the northwest of England, but we've seen a rise also across the northeast. And you've seen the action that I took yesterday, and we're prepared to do what it takes to keep people safe, whilst also protecting livelihoods, balancing the need to protect lives and livelihoods, in what everybody knows are very difficult circumstances.
How close are we to a second national lockdown?
Well, as you know, we keep all of these things under review, and we don't want to have a national action. It's the last line of defence, hence the very significant local action that I took yesterday, and we'll be making further announcements in the normal way later today, doing that work with local councils who are right there on the front line trying to find all the positive cases. That's very important. But we do have to recognise that the number of cases is rising, and we do have to act, because we know, especially from looking at other countries, that inexorably leads to more hospitalisations and sadly more deaths. And that is what we want to minimise, and we want to protect people's livelihoods at the same time.
My viewers are on the edge of their seat this morning listening to you, Health Secretary. You quote figures at them all the time, not just you, but your colleagues in government as well, quite rightly. You make comparisons with other countries in Europe, whether it's test and trace or the number of cases. We know that 10 million people are going to be in localised lockdown. My question to you is, what are you looking at to decide whether there will be a second national lockdown next month, and how close are we to that?
Well, what we look at is first and foremost the number of cases. Secondly, the survey that's put out each week on a Friday lunchtime by the Office for National Statistics. That is the single best tool that we have, because that takes into account the fact that the number of tests has been rising, which obviously impacts on the number of positive results that you get through. We also look at the number of people being hospitalised with COVID, because that's when it gets very real, and so they're the three main figures, and we look at all sorts of other pieces of information and data as well. What I'd say is that I also want to give a bit of hope. We've seen in France and Spain the number of cases really shooting up, but we also saw that in Belgium they had a start of a second spike, quite similar to what we've seen over the last few weeks here, and then they took action, and then it came down. And it came down because the country once again came together to tackle the virus. In Belgium, for instance, they introduced a rule of 5. We've introduced a rule of 6. If people follow the rule of 6, if people follow the local lockdown rules in the areas like in the northeast and Greater Manchester and other parts of the northwest, across Birmingham and parts of the West Midlands, if people follow the rules, the rule of 6 for everybody, and then the local action where that's necessary, then we can come together and defeat this virus. But we do need
My question still remains, Health Secretary, if I may, given the criteria and all of the information that you have at your fingertips, and you're looking at it ahead of later on today, how close are we this morning to a second lockdown next month?
Well, what I would say to you and to your viewers is that the virus is accelerating. We've seen that number of hospitalisations increase and double every 8 days over the last...
Several times, Health Secretary. You've said that several times. My question, on behalf of my viewers this morning, is how close are we to a second national lockdown, given all the information that you have at your fingertips on a minute-by-minute basis?
And my answer to that question is that a national lockdown is the last line of defence, and we want to use local action, and we want people to follow the rule of 6 in order to avoid it.
How close are we, though? If they don't, how close are we to a national lockdown? Do you not know?
Well, Kay, the thing is, I want to avoid a national...
We understand that. Everybody does. So how close are we, though? What do we... is it... If we carry on as we are, that we will be in a second national lockdown? What's the answer to my question?
Well, we do need to bring the number of cases down, but the answer to your question is that we keep these things under review. I can't give you that answer now, as you well know. So that's why in this very serious situation, I'm explaining what we do know, all the facts that we do know, and I'm explaining the approach that we take, the figures that we look at, and essentially the lines of defence that we go through. And that's why I'm answering your question in the way that I am. And I think, you know, having gone through this last 9 months now of this pandemic, and us discussing this all the way through it, I think your viewers understand that the approach that the government takes is to protect lives and livelihoods, and to take the action that's necessary. My goodness, we've seen that action sometimes at very short notice. Sometimes we can't say exactly what the future holds because we're in a pandemic. But I can give this hope, which is that if everybody follows the rule of 6, if everybody follows self-isolation if they have tested positive or if they have been in close contact with somebody who's tested positive, and if everybody in the local lockdown areas follows the rules near them, then we can control this virus together, but only by the country pulling together.
Yeah, the head of Test and Trace programme, Dido Harding, that you appointed, said that she did underestimate the demand for test and trace. Present test and tracing figures, 2nd to 9th of September, 250,000 capacity, 81,000 people actually tested. Why bother telling us what the capacity is? You know, that's like me saying, my capacity is to run a marathon, but I'm pushed to run 5K around the park.
I'm sorry, I don't recognise the figure that you give. The capacity...
Because they're incorrect.
Is, as you say...
Incorrect.
Well, you've quoted figures that I simply don't recognise. We're doing over 200,000 tests a day, and we do have that record capacity, but we have seen demand increase, absolutely.
Sorry, let me just take you back on that. 250,000 tests a day are being carried out, and then they go to the lab, and how many of those 250,000 are actually being tested in the lab?
Number of tests done is the measure of how many are done through the lab. So the labs are working absolutely brilliantly. They're working flat out. I've seen some flack about them in some of the newspapers. That is wrong. We're hiring, absolutely, and we're getting more resources in on the logistical side. We're putting more of the machines, of the testing machines in, and we're hiring people. So that capacity continues to grow.
Okay, so just to clarify, because obviously there's a lot of confusion over this, Health Secretary, so thank you for taking the time to clarify this. You're saying that 250,000 tests are done every single day at the moment, and give or take a few, all 250,000 are being tested in the lab?
I'm saying that the capacity is... just over 250,000. This week, over 200,000 a day are being done, and that's at that.
You mean by being done?
Levels. I don't recognise an 81,000 figure that you point out,
Okay.
but there is
Sorry, because this is really important. This is really important, and I thank you for taking the time to clarify. 250,000 tests are done every day. Tested. How many of those are then taken to the lab and subsequently tested in the lab?
The measure of the number of tests done each day is the measure of how many are done in the lab. There is a figure for capacity, and then there's a figure for the number actually processed through the lab. And the 250, just over 250,000, that's the capacity, and then the number done has been over 200,000 a day each day. That's across the UK. That's both the Lighthouse labs and those done in the NHS in all 4 nations of the UK. But the big picture point is we have the record capacity. The labs are growing, but the demand has also shot up. We all know that, and we're just driving that capacity up as much as we can. But there's also this absolutely crucial message for all of your viewers, which is if you have the coronavirus symptoms, then you should get a test. But if you don't, then you should not come forward and get a test unless you've specifically been asked to. And I've seen reports of people who have been in close contact with somebody who's tested positive and then thought, I should go and get a test and then I don't have to self-isolate. Unfortunately, that isn't true because of the virus can incubate inside you for days and days. If you've been a close contact of somebody who's tested positive, you have to self-isolate for 2 weeks. And if you get a test result that's negative, it doesn't change that. And part of the pressure on the...
One final question. One final question before I let you go. Thank you for answering all our questions honestly and frankly. Health Secretary, France, you mentioned France earlier. It's generally a couple of weeks ahead of us, like Italy, when it comes to COVID. They are reaching capacity in some hospitals in the south of the country. What is your prediction for hospitals here in the United Kingdom by the end of the month? Well,
I've seen the the reports of what's happening in France, and I've been in contact with our people in France to verify what's happening, and my heart goes out to them. There is a great challenge in some parts of France, and it just demonstrates that as cases go up, that inexorably leads to rises in hospitalisations. Here, as I said, the number of people in hospital with COVID is doubling every 8 days. And that demonstrates the need for us in government to take action, and everybody to take this disease incredibly seriously to avoid the sort of second peak that nobody wants to see.
How are you feeling, Health Secretary? It's a big burden on your shoulders, this second wave.
Well, it has been throughout, and you don't put yourself forward for these things unless you are prepared to take the big decisions. And, you know, my view is